Hello, welcome to Train Signal. This is the Tuning Management Packs lesson in the System Center 2012 Operations Manager Training course. So why would you ever have to tune a management pack? After all, they come pre-configured with all kinds of good stuff, right? Well, you may recall that elsewhere in this course, we've briefly discussed tuning management packs, and you've actually done some of that already without maybe even realizing it, by creating overrides and things like that to change the way that a management pack operates. But we want to talk about it a little bit more formally. When you tune a management pack, you're basically bending it to meet the needs of your organization rather than what Microsoft or the management pack creator thought your organization should look like. Let's say you deploy Exchange 2010. There's a lot of assumptions that Microsoft makes in the Exchange 2010 management pack that may not fit your particular use case. So you may decide you're going to make modifications in order to bend to your will the way that management pack operates. And really, this lesson is going to bring together some things you've seen in other lessons in this course. So you'll begin to understand how all of the pieces of the management pack work together to a cohesive whole. The reasons you tune a management pack are wide and varied. And there's a lot of good, sound business reasons for why you would do so. First of all, this can prevent administrators from being burdened by unnecessary alerts. Sometimes you may get all kinds of warnings raised in the console that really don't matter. They may seem to matter at the time, but when you start digging deeper, you realize, okay, yeah, there are issues that need to be taken care of, but frankly, they're not that critical right now. So I'm going to disable those monitors so that I don't get alerts all the time for things that really don't matter to me right now when I've got bigger fish to fry. And when you deploy a management pack, things still change in your environment. With tuning of a management pack, you can ensure that Operations Manager keeps pace with changes that are going on in your business. And every organization is different and has different policies. You can make sure that monitoring supports individual organizational policies that may not fit what comes with the base management pack. So let's talk about some of the primary ways by which you'll tune a management pack. The first is what's called an override. And this is really a customization that's made to a sealed management pack, or a way that you change something from a sealed management pack so that it deviates from its pre-assigned behavior to meet the needs of your organization. Elsewhere in this course, we've already created some overrides, and you may or may not have seen them yet, but what the purpose of an override is to make sure that you're monitoring what makes sense for you and not what makes sense for somebody else. When you're creating overrides, there's some best practices to which you should definitely adhere. Name the override management pack in some kind of form so you can tell that it's custom or an override. For example, there's two examples actually on your screen. Original management pack name overrides. For example, Windows Server 2012 DNS, and then you would put overrides after it. Or custom, and then the management pack name. But in some way, shape, or form, make sure you create a management pack for your overrides so that you have an easier administrative experience on down the line when you have to manage management packs, such as remove them or upgrade them. If you start trying to mix and match overrides between management packs, you begin to have dependencies that can make it difficult to delete a management pack. So for example, if you've got one management pack for all of your overrides and you have to delete that management pack in order to make room for something else, you're going to have a mess on your hands because you've got to delete all of your overrides rather than just the ones that are necessary for you to perform an upgrade of a single management pack. Now, this can also serve to group original and override management packs, or to group all of the custom management packs together, depending on how you decide to name your management packs. But whatever you choose, just make sure you're consistent. Otherwise, it's a pain in the neck to find things later on. So why would you bother to create an override? Well, let's talk about some of these reasons. Organizational policy requires us to raise disk space alert at 15%. By default, disk space warnings are raised at 10%, and disk space errors are raised at 5% in Operations Manager with the default settings in the management packs. 15% is a deviation from this norm, so you have to create an override to make that change. Or Well, when it comes to our domain controllers, we're quite a bit stricter than we are about it with our other systems. So let's take this for example. For our domain controllers, we want to raise a warning when we're below 20% free disk space. You can do that through what's called targeting of a particular override in the management pack. And you'll see that actually in action in the demonstration portion of this lesson. For our file servers, we want to raise disk space warnings at 15% of free, not 5%. I think you may see a pattern developing here probably. You're able to make custom changes that really help you best configure Operations Manager to the needs of your organization. So let's talk a little bit about that targeting word that I used. You can actually target just a single object with an override. So let's say you want to target just a logical disk. You want just a logical disk on one server to be changed so that at 15% a warning is raised for free disk space levels. You can do that. You can say, okay, for this particular override, I want to target at just file 1, our file server in the organization. Or you can tell Operations Manager to target it at all logical disks in the organization. And it's not that hard to do, and I'll show you how to do that later on. But there can be conflict. Now, as you might imagine, if you have the ability to target very different pieces of the infrastructure, you can actually begin to get into trouble. So, what happens is Operations Manager says, okay, we're first going to apply all the object class overrides. If you say this particular override targets all physical disks in the organization, well, that's going to be the first time it applies overrides. Let's say that says 20% free disk space. So that means every disk in the organization will get a warning to 20%. Next, though, we have a group. You can create a group, and we've talked about groups in this course too, that has 2 members in it that have different overrides. So you could have a group that says, well, for these systems, we want to do it at 18%. Well, what happens then is Operations Manager will say, okay, it was 20% because of the fact that they're a disk object, but this group now gets 18%. And then finally down to the object level. And this allows you to be able to be very granular with how you can apply overrides and still do so in a way that makes it a little bit easier administratively. So it applies overrides to first the objects, then the group, then the object. Now this assumes, however, that you've created all these overrides. If you have not created overrides at the object class or group levels, then only the ones that are targeted at particular objects, if there are any, will be applied. So this is just a way that you can have some conflict resolution and understand sort of how targeting and basically the overrides will flow down through the Operations Manager hierarchy. But what happens if you've got 2 of the same item in a group and you want it to be a little bit different? This is where enforced attributes come into play. This provides you the way to make sure that a particular override is applied to the correct object. It's basically just another conflict resolution mechanism, and I'll show you how that kind of works, where you do this when we create overrides later on in this lesson. So the general process for creating an override is listed on your screen. You've got to decide which metrics you wish to leave in place and those you wish to modify. Now, what I recommend is you carefully study every management pack that you deploy into the organization and determine which items you want to keep and which ones you want to change and which ones you want to get rid of. You'll then create override management packs for each management pack that contains metrics you plan to override. And we've talked about that. You want to make sure you've got those separate management packs just to make life a little bit easier. And then decide exactly which objects you wish to target with new overrides. Will you do it at an object class level? Will you do it at a group level? Or are you going to choose individual targets for your overrides? And then finally, create the overrides and save them to the various overrides management packs that you've created as a part of your planning process. Okay, now let's work a little bit with overrides. First of all, for the server name SCOM-SQL, this is our SQL server we've been using in this course, we're going to raise an error when free disk space gets below 95%. Now, you might be saying, 95%? Is the guy insane? But in this case, we want to force an error. We're trying to actually make it provide an error. just so that you can see what happens when you override a rule. So in this case, we're actually going with an insane number just because we want to be able to demonstrate the concept. Now, it's not going to be quite as easy as it sounds because there is some tricky stuff that the Operations Manager will throw your way. And I'll explain that when we get over to the Operations Manager console. For the server name file1, we're going to disable disk space monitoring altogether, and I'll show you how to do that as well. While you're watching the demo, I'm also going to be talking a little bit about targeting when you target different systems or different groups or different object types with an override. And you'll get to see the enforced attribute option where you actually apply that. So, without further ado, let's get over to the Operations Manager console and carry out these tasks. And here we are at the Operations Manager console. And I'm just going to go to Windows computers because we're working with a couple of Windows computers here. So this is the easiest place to go to get started with the process. And you can see that I've got a server name, scom-sql. Now, there's a lot of different ways you can go about creating overrides. This is the way I like to do it. Right-click the item and choose Open, and then choose the Health Explorer. As you may have seen before, Health Explorer generally scopes to only things that aren't working. So we're going to disable that so we can see everything that's being monitored right now with regard to this particular object. Now, disk space is actually an availability mechanism. So we're going to scroll down and expand availability, and it's a hardware device, and it happens to be the C drive. And you can see we now have logical free disk space. Now I'm going to right-click logical free disk space, and I'm going to open up the monitor properties. Next, let's go to overrides. And we're going to choose the override option for this object. Now let me talk about what you're seeing on the screen right here. By choosing for this object, I'm going to tell Operations Manager that for the C drive on scom-sql, I want to create an override. If I were to choose for all objects of the class, then everything that's a logical disk for Windows Server 2008 would be included in this override. So that would mean this rule would apply to all objects that have a logical disk drive. Or if I created a group, now we talked about groups in this course as well, I can apply this override to a group. Or I can apply this to a specific object. Now in this case I have scom-sql selected, but if I were to select this option, I would be able to choose one of the other items that has a logical disk that's associated with Windows Server 2008's Logical Disk Management Pack. Or I could choose for all objects of another class, which we're not going to do because we're interested in this class. So, for the object. Now, when you open up the override properties page, you're going to see that there's actually a lot of information here. There's more than just free disk space and warning disk space and all that good stuff. There's alert priority, there's alert on state, there's this error percent stuff, there's error megabyte stuff, and you're going to see that there's quite a few pieces of information here. Well, what we're interested in is this. I'm going to expand this a little bit so we can see more. We're interested in the error percent threshold really for system drives because we're really worried about the system drive, not the other drives in the server. So I'm going to select the override box next to error percent threshold for system drives. And I'm going to put 95 in that box. Now, at this point, you could click apply or click OK and be done with everything. But you'd be waiting for a very long time for the system to actually throw an error. Well, and when you look at the system, you'd go, well, wait a minute, it's only got about 85% disk space available. I've told it I want 95% disk space to throw an error. Well, there's a catch. You'll notice a little bit farther below, we also have an error megabyte threshold for system drives. Both counters have to be in an error state in order for an error to be raised in the Operations Manager console. How do I know this? It doesn't say it anywhere on the screen, does it? No, it doesn't. It actually does not say it anywhere on the screen. Where it does say it, however, is in the management pack documentation. This is another reason why it's so important to read the management pack documentation, because you will save yourself hours upon hours of frustration sitting there trying to figure out why in the heck your overrides or whatever you're trying to accomplish are not working. Now, right now, you're going to see that we have set for 300 megabytes an error threshold. Well, this disk is something like 129 megabytes or something like that. So if I go to 3,000, that's 3 gigabytes. If I go to 30,000, that's 30 gigabytes. So we're going to go to 120,000. And that's going to give us an option to basically say, okay, at this ridiculously high number, then we're going to be able to throw an error up in the Operations Manager console. If we don't do both of these things, the error will never be raised. Now, there is a way around this. You could disable certain pieces of this, but for our purposes here, we're going to keep this in place, and we're going to allow it to work its magic using both variables. Now, if we wanted to, we could also change the warning threshold. We're not going to do that for this particular monitor, but we're just going to keep these in place and move forward. Now, as always, we have to select a destination management pack. Well, we have not used a management pack for overrides yet, so I'm going to create a new one. I'm going to call it Windows 2008 Logical Disk. And click Next. And click Create. This will take Operations Manager a second to create the management pack. And then I'm going to click the Apply button so you can see what happens next. Keep an eye on the effective value up here. Now, the effective value, where it was 5, is now 95%. And where it was 300 megabytes is now 120,000 megabytes. So, we've successfully modified, through an override, the point at which this system will return an error state. Now, if you'd like to view a summary for the monitor, you can get some information about what is actually going on with this monitor. And you can see that we've overridden 2 parameters, error megabyte threshold and error percent threshold. At this point, I can actually tell Operations Manager to go out and recalculate the health of this object. It can take a little while for Operations Manager to actually naturally get new and updated information when Windows crosses that threshold. This is because Operations Manager is not constantly looking at everything that has to go on out in the environment. If it was, there'd be so much traffic on your network and so much process utilization that nothing would work. So what happens, let me go back to that monitor. Hardware availability of the C drive, logical free disk space. Let me open it up for properties. And you'll see that this basically goes every 15 minutes or so, but it can actually take a little bit longer for the system to come right back with everything that it needs in order to be able to raise that alert. So, don't get too close. Basically, if you're going to get to a point where once you run out of disk space, you only have 15 minutes left of runtime, that's not going to help you very much with Operations Manager. Make sure that when you're doing something like this, that you're taking into account the amount of time that it takes an agent to update the Operations Manager system with information that may be changing in the environment. In this case, we could be waiting for up to 15 minutes for the Operations Manager console to reflect the fact that the server that we've just configured is out of disk space or is running low on disk space. And I can periodically refresh this page just to try to see if it comes back with new information. And so far it hasn't, but I know that it will. So while we're waiting for that to happen, let's go over and disable monitoring of the C drive for file 1. So, similar to what we did before, select file 1, right-click him, and choose Open, Health Explorer. Now, close the scope, or the filter, go to availability, hardware availability rollup, availability. And this time, we're going to go to override, and we're going to choose disable the monitor for this object. You'll notice that brings up the override properties page, just like we saw before. But this time, we have placed a checkbox in the parameter name of enabled and changed the override value to false. Now, this might be a little confusing, but what we're saying is the default value is true. This monitor is enabled. We're going to change the value to false. And we're going to save it back out in the logical. And click apply. And now, basically, regardless of how low file 1 gets on disk space, it will not be reported back in the console. We're still waiting for, it looks like SCOM SQL to catch up. So I'm going to pause the video while we wait for that to happen. And we are back, and as you can see, we now have a critical element here. And let's right-click it, choose Open, Health Explorer, and you're going to see that logical free disk space has indeed gone into an error condition. But you know, that's not enough information. Let's find out why that's happened. We really know why because we just forced it to do that, but let's just make believe for a second. We'll right-click the item again, and this time we're going to choose Open Performance View. Now we know the values at which we set those thresholds when we created the override. Well, if you look down here, this is basically a performance view, just like Performance Monitor if you've used that in Windows. And we've got listed by object a whole bunch of different pieces of information, including the logical disk element. So we have free megabytes, % free space. There's free megabytes, right? And as you can see, we created it at like 128 gigs. We're definitely below that, where it looks like we're about 109 or so gigs available. So yes, we're below that threshold. And if I go to % free space, yeah, it's definitely below 95 because this value here is going to be what, 82, 84%. So you can see that both of those metrics are now below the threshold at which we've defined that to be an error condition. And also, just to give you a look at this screen, it's another way that you can use some of the information that's in Operations Manager to try to determine what's going on in the environment. While we're here, let me show you something else. You can also select the time range. So, I'm going to change this to the one last, let's go 40 days, just for the heck of it, just to get as much information as we can. Well, it only started capturing information recently, so there's not a lot of information, but you can see just a little bit that it starts going downhill. And this is one way that with the right kind of reporting and information in Operations Manager that you can begin to capture additional pieces of information and start showing trends. Let me try to narrow that range a little bit. And it's slightly downward, but it kind of gives you an idea of what the trend is looking like with regard to free disk space in Operations Manager. I want to show you that you can basically modify the chart a little bit so that you're able to get a better visual look at it. And one of the ones that was actually more interesting was the one that I closed a second ago, which was the % idle time chart. You're actually seeing the disk actually do something here. Now, 100% idle time means the disk is doing nothing. And as you can see, there's lots of times when it is doing very little or doing nothing, but there's a lot of times where it's actually doing quite a bit of work as well. And once again, you're going to see that there's lots of pieces of information there. Disk queue length is actually a very important metric. We're actually in reasonably decent shape here. We spiked to 5 at one point, and what that means is that that's the number of outstanding requests that the disk needed to service. The bigger that number, the bigger problem you have with storage. Now, right now, we're not seeing big numbers all the time. But if we were seeing disk queue length staying above 5 and going to 10 and 15, we'd have a serious problem in the environment. And the reason for that is because disk queue length is a primary indicator of performance issues. And what they generally point to is the need for more disks. Now, that's not for capacity, but that's because it's showing that you don't have enough IOPS to service what is in the environment. So if you start seeing this number go very high, you start having problems in the environment. I know this is not what we talked about in the lesson, but it's just a few additional pieces of information. Now we have disk transfer rate, how fast is information being transferred, and what is the metric here is probably something like megabytes per second. And then we're health service. Now we also saw some RAM metrics. We have available RAM, and you can see that that's actually all over the place as well. And again, that just depends on what's running on the system, right? If there's more running on the system, there's going to be more or less RAM available. Available memory. So you kind of get the idea. By using this health view that's sort of a graph, you can kind of get a visual representation of really what's going on with your operations manager environment in a way that's really hard to capture otherwise. I mean, really, when you just have a list of numbers or just something that says critical, that's not a lot of information. But by being able to drill down more visually, I think it really helps to determine what's really happening in the environment. Thank you for listening, and I look forward to seeing you in the next lesson.